It is 9 a.m. in the West. It is noon in the East, and that means it is Lunch with Lincoln for Monday, April 11th, 2022. I am your host today, Reed Galen, co-founder of the Lincoln Project. Glad to be back in front of everyone. My guest today is journalist and author Chris Whipple. Chris, thanks for joining me today.
Great to be with you.
So, Chris, you and I were talking a little bit earlier. You had a long and distinguished career in broadcast journalism, 60 Minutes, ABC's Prime Time, and you left about 10 years ago to produce documentaries, and out of those documentaries have come a couple of books. The first called The Gatekeepers, which is about White House chiefs of staff, which is, I think, a job that, if you've been lucky enough to work at the White House, you understand what they do. But most folks probably don't have a real sense of what that job is. The second is a book called Spy Masters about being the director of Central Intelligence, running the CIA. Those books are available to Amazon or all your local favorite local booksellers. And you have one coming out in October called The Fight of His Life Inside Joe Biden's White House. That'll be out, as I said, later this year. So I want to get to all of those, but I want to tie all these things together. So, Chris, let's first talk about the chiefs of staff. So as I mentioned to you, I was lucky enough to work at the White House 20 years ago. Andy Card was the chief of staff to President George W. Bush when I was there. And he used to give a great speech. And he said, the chief of staff is not the co-president. It's not the prime minister. It is the chief of staff. And, he is in charge of, or he or she are in charge of keeping track of the White House, making sure it operates efficiently, but also making sure that the president's time, which regardless of the president is some of the most valuable on the planet, is used appropriately. That, things that should not get to the president before they're supposed to get there, that he has time to sleep, eat, exercise, and, do something other than trying to be president at any given moment. So what was your sense of the folks that you talked to in a job that is, a crucible in its own way, right? As I said with Card, I remember he was at the White House long before President Bush got going, and President Bush got going early, and left long after President Bush had gone up to the residence. So what's the sense of, is there an archetype for this job?
Well, what I learned, Reed, from writing The Gatekeepers is that it's almost impossible to overstate the importance of the position. I mean, every president learns, often the hard way, that you cannot govern effectively without empowering a White House chief of staff as first among equals to do any number of things, but first and foremost execute his agenda and maybe ultimately tell him what he doesn't want to hear. That's the most important job for any White House chief of staff, and the great ones, the Jim Bakers and the Leon Panettas and some others, could walk into the Oval Office, close the door, and tell the president hard truths.
Right.
We never saw any of that happening in Mr. Trump's White House, but that's the way great chiefs of staff are made. And I gotta just briefly tell you, it's also a relentless, thankless job. You get all of the blame and none of the credit. My favorite Andy Card story is the time that he met John Spencer, who was playing Leo McGarry in West Wing.
Sure.
And Spencer looked at Card, who was the sitting White House chief, and said, "How much do you make?" And Card looked back at him and said, "Well, it's 150K or whatever it was." And Spencer looked at him mystified and said, "Was that per episode?" That's my favorite Andy Card story.
So, I mean, a lot of folks don't understand. So, in the hierarchy of the White House, obviously there's the president, the vice president, and then there's the chief of staff, and there's assistants to the president. Might be the national security advisor, might be the chief of the council of economic advisors, some communications director, press secretary, counselors, whatever they are. And they all have a very rarefied air, right? They're the few people probably who could walk into the Oval Office without a prior appointment, walk-in privileges, right? Probably one of the rarest things on earth. But it's the chief of staff who's got to make sure that everyone understands, like, yes, you have this title and you are able to do these things, but that doesn't mean that you come to the president with whatever pet project or nagging thing you might have, right? That's not your job.
No, it's absolutely true. I mean, and hence the title, the gatekeepers. The White House chief has to have control over who has access to the Oval Office, and at the very least know who's coming and going. H.R. Haldeman was, of course, under Nixon was the poster boy for Watergate, and yet, if you talk to all of the living White House chiefs of staff today, they will tell you to a person that Haldeman wrote the template for how to be an effective White House chief of staff. They called him the Berlin Wall, among other things, because he allegedly walled Nixon off from people who needed to see him. That wasn't the case. What Haldeman did successfully was create time and space for Nixon to think. Now, that might have been a bad thing for the country and a good thing for Nixon.
Mm-hmm.
But in any event, it's what a chief of staff has to be able to do.
And so the chief of staff, as we think about it, was this part of the sort of broader reorganization of the government in the post-World War II era? Had there been? I know that like Roosevelt, FDR had, he had a Harry Hopkins, he had a military chief of staff, but was FDR the first person to really take advantage of?
No, it really began with Dwight Eisenhower, and the position is really the civilian version of Ike's Army chief of staff. The very first Sherman Adams was Ike's chief of staff. He was a gruff, tough guy. His nickname was the Abominable No Man, and he was a very effective gatekeeper. But it really, there was no such position, really. The founding fathers never imagined anything like it. But the truth is that really since Nixon, no president has been able to govern effectively without empowering a White House chief. Jimmy Carter thought he could get away without one. And he ultimately realized about 3 years into his presidency that he had to have a White House chief, named the wrong guy, Hamilton Jordan, and finally got it right in his last year with a guy named Jack Watson, who was really effective, but it was too late, really.
Right.
Carter.
Well, because I mean, that's the thing, is that, the executive branch is, the agencies alone could be hundreds of thousands, millions of people. Then you've got the military, which is millions of people all by itself. And then, you've got to have somebody who understands, I guess, the ins and outs of Washington, D.C. enough to be able to go to the Capitol, deal with legislative leaders or individual legislators or, members of Congress or senators. And then all of the other, mini power centers of Washington, D.C., whether or not it's, something like the U.S. Chamber, the AFL-CIO. Everybody wants something from the president. From the White House, because they assume that the White House can do and can do anything, and just would do it if they wanted to, right?
Yeah, governing is complicated, and there really hasn't been anything. There really hasn't been any such thing as cabinet government, quote unquote, since the Nixon administration. Which is not to say that the cabinet isn't important, but really, in all these decades since Nixon, the power is really in the West Wing.
Right.
It flows from the president to the White House chief and on down. And again, you've got to have somebody who can execute the president's agenda, and somebody who understands. I mean, Jim Baker was the master at this. He understood how to thread the needle between policy and politics. You had to be able to take policy and turn it into reality, get it passed on the Hill, make things happen. Baker was a master at that, and it's a very rare skill set. But the most important is, again, telling the president what he doesn't want to hear. And Dick Cheney, of all people, who was obviously a controversial vice president, to put it mildly, was once upon a time, he was Jerry Ford's White House chief, 34 years old, the most popular guy in town. But he understood that you can't have, as he put it, 8 or 9 guys sitting around when you've got a tough thing to tell the president going, it's your turn to tell him. No, it's your turn to tell him. No, it's your turn.
So that's a good segue, because you mentioned him briefly, which is Donald Trump had multiple chiefs of staff, but that did seem to be the sort of either musical chairs or Russian roulette, depending on how you want to look at it, of someone who would have to go in and tell the president, that particular president, something they didn't want to hear, when his version of reality did not, and frankly still does not, comport with many other people's.
Trump never wanted to hear the truth. Trump was convinced that he knew everything worth knowing. And in fact, this was true, not only this made the job of White House chief impossible, but it also made other jobs impossible. CIA director, for example. I wrote a piece for the Washington Post back then when Trump was in office, saying that he was calling him the unbriefable president. You couldn't brief him. He wasn't going to listen to anything that contradicted whatever he wanted to believe. So that made it impossible for White House chiefs and CIA directors alike. And ultimately, of course, Trump got the chief of staff he'd always wanted, in the form of Mark Meadows, who, in my mind, wasn't so much a chief as a kind of glad-handing maitre d', who would happily execute anything Trump asked him to do, no matter how cockamamie or illegal, culminating, of course, in that infamous phone call to the Georgia Secretary of State looking to steal votes and keep Trump in office.
I mean, between the Georgia Secretary of State, we've seen now, these messages between Meadows and Ginny Thomas, the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. I mean, Meadows had been a member of Congress, right? He was not a neophyte to Washington, D.C. He had to know, Chris, what he was doing, right? This wasn't like, oh, the president asked me to do this, so I've got to do it. He knew the implications of the messages he was sending and receiving and the requests he was making of people.
Well, I can't read Mark Meadows' mind, but I will tell you that it used to be that there was a really healthy competition for the title of worst White House chief of staff in history. Meadows owns it now by a country mile. There's no competition for that title. Meadows owns it, and it's because he was the ultimate sycophant. He was somebody who saluted and did whatever he was told. And we've seen innumerable examples of that, including, passing along these absurd suggestions from Donald Trump Jr. To win the election without winning it. So it's just again, I think that he's in a class by himself.
So let me bring these two things together. So you've got a Meadows as a chief of staff. You got a Donald Trump as a president. Then you've got Gina Haspel, who was director of Central Intelligence under Trump. And before I get to her in particular, I just want to go back to that. Was it that first week he was in office, Trump was in office, when he went out to Langley and was speaking to the agency staff and the officers there, and made it all about him.
It was literally his first day in office.
Right.
He went out to CIA headquarters.
Right.
He went to a place at CIA which is considered hallowed ground. It's the Memorial Wall right at the entrance before you go into CIA headquarters. And it has stars representing CIA officers, fallen officers in the line of duty who've died serving the country.
Most of whose names we'll never know.
Many of whose names are not revealed. There's a book there that you can flip through, and it has the names of some, but not others, depending on what their undercover roles were or not. Anyway, Trump went there and gave this unabashed, egocentric tirade about his campaign, and this was again in front of in the most hallowed ground at CIA. Needless to say, it did not go over well. Fast forward, I think Mike Pompeo and Gina Haspel and Trump really did lasting damage to the CIA. They went along with politicizing the agency in a way that would have made Richard Nixon blush. The way in which everything was skewed to Trump's liking, and so I think the CIA under Bill Burns is still recovering from that.
Yeah, and I think that's the one thing that we don't spend a lot of time talking about, because I think it's in some ways it's hard to see, it's hard to make it tangible, is that institutional damage. So you take something, Chris, like what we're seeing in the Ukraine, or not the Ukraine, I should say Ukraine, now where the Russians have invaded. It seems like that this CIA, this president, this White House have been maybe as forthcoming with publicizing intelligence as they ever have been, because they know that's part of pushing back on Putin's game, and I think they've been successful at it. But how much damage was done with Trump's bootlicking demeanor towards Putin when, if you've ever been there, I met the guy, I met Putin 20 years ago when I was over there. Like you could, you stand in front of this guy, like you get the chill down your spine, right? Like this is not a good guy. What kind of damage did they do in those 4 years to an institution like the CIA?
Well, we'll never know for sure without being there ourselves. But I do think that Bill Burns was the perfect antidote to that, because he really, it's hard to think of anybody more qualified to tell his analysts that he wants to hear it straight without fear or favor than Bill Burns, who was really a legendary, consummate diplomat, as you know, for years. You'd have to say only maybe Henry Kissinger and Dick Holbrooke maybe were in the same league. He's legendary, and he's a straight shooter, and everybody knows it, and he demands that. So I think that the CIA is in a much better place than it was, but that kind of thing can take time to recover from.
Well, and it's an agency. It's mythical, right? It exists in reality, but the mythology of it is bigger probably in the minds of individual Americans, or the world even, than what goes on there every day. And it's been, since it was formed, I guess, during the Truman administration after World War II, it's had characters like Allen Dulles, coups, the Bay of Pigs, all of these things, that sort of pumped it up, and it became, bigger than life. Now they obviously overthrew 2 sovereign governments in the 50s, so they did do a lot of those things. But what's your sense of the people that had to run that agency? Because it is something where probably even in presidents' minds, it's mythological if they don't really know much about it.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And in the Spy Masters, I write about the agency from the time of Richard Helms, who was the quintessential old school CIA director, dry martini in one hand, cigarette in the other.
Right.
Who had to deal with LBJ and Richard Nixon, not an easy job by any means. And then I bring it all the way up to Pompeo and Haspel. It's a cast of characters that you couldn't dream up, including Bill Colby, who followed Helms and revealed the so-called family jewels, all of the CIA's darkest secrets back in the 70s. You've got William Casey, who waged covert wars all over the world, was up to his neck in Iran-Contra. This is a guy who was so sloppy, and that he at meals he would use his tie as a napkin. Anyway, and yet,
he was also one of those guys who'd been an OSS man in World War II.
that's right.
So to him, if Churchill said, set Europe ablaze, Casey was like, set the world ablaze, right?
Yeah. So it's a great rogues gallery of characters that I write about in the Spy Masters. But as far as my take on the overarching story of the CIA is, there's no question about it that it was up to all kinds of malfeasance at times. You mentioned overthrowing governments, and obviously the weapons of mass destruction fiasco was really damaging. But having said that, the legend was that the CIA was a rogue elephant, in Frank Church's famous phrase.
Sure.
And I think the CIA was more often a check on rogue presidents. And the first great example of that is Richard Nixon, who tried to get Richard Helms at the CIA to cover up Watergate by calling off the FBI. Helms would not do it. He stood up to Nixon. He'd done other shady stuff for LBJ in the past, but when it counted, he stood up to Nixon, arguably sinking Nixon and saving the CIA.
Now, well, also the CIA's charter doesn't. It is by law not allowed to operate on the U.S. soil. Correct.
That's right. That's right. And was, even when Helms was authorizing domestic surveillance of Vietnam War protesters. So he was no angel. He bent the rules, but when it counted, he stood up to Nixon and Watergate. Now fast forward all the way up to Trump and his first impeachment. And there's a kind of symmetry to this, because it was as we know, a CIA employee who blew the whistle on Nixon and his phone call to Zelensky when he tried to shake him down for dirt on Joe Biden.
Right.
So I think the CIA has often been a check on rogue presidents.
Well, let me ask you this. I've never been part of or near a call like that. But if a president makes a call to a foreign leader, there's Colonel Vindman, there's Fiona Hill, then there's the CIA whistleblower. How many other people are listening?
Well, a handful for sure. And it's a lot of people forget that among those who were on that phone call was Mike Pompeo. Mm-hmm. There's no question in my mind that was an attempted shakedown of Zelensky for dirt on Joe Biden. But Pompeo would like everybody to forget that he was on that call. He was. But it's just another sign of the power of the cult of personality that, people like Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff at the time, would burst into the White House press briefing room and say, "Get over it. This is what we do." Well, it was clearly out of line. It was clearly a shakedown of a foreign country that was obviously in danger, as we now know more than ever.
Let me ask you, Chris, one question during the Trump piece of this. The reason I bring it up is because so much of Trump, he never leaves, and his people are always around. We're in the New York Times about Jared Kushner getting basically a $2 billion fund from the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. The chief of staff, Kushner wasn't the chief of staff, but he might as well have been. He wasn't the campaign manager, but he might as well have been. You talk about being a check, he didn't just suddenly show up in Riyadh one day a week ago and say, "Hey, I'd like $2 billion. This was a relationship that he was building. So the CIA must have been aware of this. This was a guy who set up a back channel phone system at the Russian embassy, right? Yeah. So to your point, they were they should have been a check. Ultimately, they were on Donald Trump through the Ukraine piece. But I guess my question is, what the hell else was out there that we still don't know about? I know it's speculative, and I'm sorry to ask you a question like that.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that there's a lot for us still to learn. Now, I can recall talking to the former head of the of Russia operations at the CIA shortly after Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin had their joint press conference in Austria. You remember the infamous one in which Trump claimed that he believed Putin over our own intelligence agencies. And this CIA officer said to me, at that moment, he became convinced that Vladimir Putin had something on Trump.
Yeah.
But he didn't know what. And I think sometimes we can overestimate the CIA's ability. We expect them to know everything, see everything. I just don't know to what extent they know more than we realize about Kushner and his activities. I mean, obviously, their charter is not to spy on American officials, and only to and their charter is overseas, right. not on our soil.
I guess maybe then theoretically they could have picked something up, in whatever sources they have in Saudi Arabia or nearby. That would have led them back. But before we've got a few minutes left, let's talk about your next book to the extent you can. It's called The Fight of His Life Inside Joe Biden's White House, and that'll come out this fall. I guess it's pretty trite, Chris, to say that everyone has a moment, and the question is whether or not they meet it. From my perspective, Biden's had several moments in his life, and he's met them. One was, I think, the crushing loss of a wife and daughter early, then a crushing loss of his son, Beau. But then when the time came to find someone who could beat Donald Trump, it came together and he met that moment. And then I think most recently, just a couple of months ago now, when it was clear, or I guess in retrospect, it appeared clear that Putin was going to invade Ukraine, Biden met it. And I feel this in my bones, Chris, that Europe and our NATO allies looked back across the Atlantic to see whether or not Joe Biden would be there. And he said, I'm here and we're not going anywhere.
Well, the story is being written as we speak.
Yeah.
And literally in my case, I mean, this was to mix my metaphors, this is trying to design an airplane in mid-flight. And
I've been there.
And I've got to try to land it in the next couple of months. My publisher doesn't want me to talk too much about it because it's out in October, but everyone can pre-order it at Amazon or Simon & Schuster or Barnes & Noble, anywhere you like. To your point, you can really look at Joe Biden's life and career as a kind of fight. I agree with you, against adversity, tragedy, bad luck. He lost his wife and infant daughter. He lost his son, Beau Biden. He had plenty of bad luck and lost 2 campaigns for the presidency. His father always said, get back up. And he did. And he finally won the presidency. And he had the toughest agenda, the most challenging array of problems to deal with of any president since FDR. And now along comes an invasion of a democracy in the heart of Europe with the risk of spilling over into NATO and the prospect of escalation to nuclear war. That is the fight of Joe Biden's life.
Right.
And we are living through that history, and we will see if he meets that moment. He's only begun to do it, but it's a hell of a story.
So, one thing that you and I were talking about just in our last couple of minutes here was when President Biden was in Poland giving his speech. He's a long-time ad-libber. This is a guy who is not afraid to go off script, and he said, Vladimir Putin. I'll paraphrase. Vladimir Putin shouldn't be in power. And lots of you could hear and feel the wringing of hands in the Situation Room and the State Department and everywhere. And they walked back the statement. They walked back
slapping their foreheads. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, again, having been lucky enough to work at a White House, not for nothing, the president I work for would have said, I want all of you in the hold room right now. We're going to have a talk, and we're going to remind you who the president is. It's not you. And I think you felt that when he went back, when he was at the White House not too long ago, and said it again. And just sort of as a reminder, not only to the world what he meant, but also maybe to his own folks, like, hey, if I say something, talk to me if you think we need to walk it back.
It's a speech that will go down in history. There's no question about it. And it was a great speech even before the ad lib. Arguably, the ad lib made it even better. And I agree with you. I'm not sure they should have walked it back. It reminded me of a story I tell in The Gatekeepers about Reagan's speech at the Berlin Wall. He was on his way there in a limousine to the Brandenburg Gate. He sees this line in the speech, and he turns to his chief of staff, Ken Duberstein, and says, and he knows that it's a controversial line. He says, Ken, it's going to drive the boys at the State Department crazy, but I'm going to leave the line in.
Right.
And moments later came, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Right.
This was arguably a kind of similar moment for Joe Biden. I mean, this was Joe Biden's authenticity coming through. This was a line nobody wanted him to say. All the pinstriped diplomats were, having heart attacks, and he did it. And as you say, they walked it back, and Joe Biden walked it out again the next time he was in public. So I think it's arguably going to be a famous line from a famous speech.
No, and I think that the one thing that Biden has always had going for him, and I think too many politicians now believe that their job is to be performative first, is that authenticity works because in those moments, as you said, Chris, the real person comes out. Joe Biden, not someone who's ever really hid his own reality. And I think that, to your point, is what made it so powerful, was this is someone who, whatever it is we see in the news, he and his chief of staff, Ron Klain, and Burns, and the National Security Council are seeing far worse, probably. And he felt it. And this is a guy who feels. And I think that's always been something that Americans would prefer in their presidents, because it's humanizing when a president can be, frankly, two-dimensional, because you only ever see him on television, right? So, well, listen, Chris, I want to thank you for joining me today. Again, everybody, I want to make sure you go out and get these books. The Gatekeepers, about the White House Chiefs of Staff. Spy Masters, about the Directors of Central Intelligence. And look forward to this fall, in October, the fight of his life inside Joe Biden's White House. Chris, I want to thank you for joining us. I hope you'll come back. Everybody, we will see you again on Friday. Do not forget, Tuesdays and Thursdays, The Breakdown with Tara and Rick. Wednesday, we're speaking with Lisa and Maya. And if you have not checked out the Lincoln Project podcast, you can find me there twice a week. Go to your favorite podcast app. Chris, thanks again. And everybody, we'll see you next time.
My pleasure. Thanks, Reed.